So the last topic in our series on the myth that you don't need a lawyer for innocent is the subject of flawed forensic testing. So this is like forensic evidence. This is the type of stuff that people see on like CSI and often considered the most reliable evidence on TV. Scientific evidence, like say the DNA or the fingerprint or advanced investigation technique. This is an area where science is supreme, but the errors are latent and they're there.
The errors absolutely are there, and you can see it in a variety of different ways. You can see it in one of the great examples that we, whenever we're thinking about flawed forensic testing for Murat and I, we think about the two Department of Public Health chemists, Dookhan and Sonja Farak, both for a variety of different ways. With Dookhan, she was involved in dry labbing, which essentially she would look at evidence that was on her desk, assume this is going to be heroin, and write a certificate saying, yes, that was the case. It then got sent to another chemist who did confirmatory testing. If she was right, fantastic. If she was wrong, what she would do is she would taint and mix the samples up. She was able to do a tremendous amount of analysis on drug cases because she wasn't doing the analysis and she was just saying whatever it is that she wanted to say.
And that resulted in the erroneous conviction of thousands of individuals and one of the greatest forensic scandals to have ever touched this country. And what really is remarkable about what happened with Dookhan and Sonja Farak, the other chemist, and her situation was a little bit different in terms of her motivation, but the harm was the same. And what she was doing was she was a drug addict and she was using some of the drugs that were stored in the Amherst laboratory. And what she would end up doing then would be to take drugs and contaminate samples in order to cover up what it was that she was doing. And again, so many people, so much carnage and suffering arose out of that incident. What really is astonishing to me is what happened after the fact of those two incidents, the tremendous government cover-up that happened. So I can remember because, this was happening in real time before our eyes, but with Dookhan, when the first sort of hint of misconduct was occurring, just the overwhelming instinct on the part of trusted government professionals trying to cabin it, trying to claim that it was really sort of an isolated incident. And so what they did was they came out with a report saying, oh, we've identified this problem, we're heroes because we're coming out and being forthcoming about it, but trust me, it only affected a few cases, and shutting the file and closing evidence from the public view that in fact what Dookhan did and what was initially revealed was just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, tens of thousands of cases being affected by this misconduct that was taking place, that the instinct by the government was to say, we don't want to release this information, this bombshell. And that's what it was. It was a bombshell of a chemist who was not only doing poor scientific work, lying about it, filing false affidavits, misleading different police investigations and court cases, testifying untruthfully, and this all could have just been addressed up front and justice could have been sought, but instead the government's reaction was, let's sweep this under the rug. And thankfully, with some great defense work, this was able to come to light and show that this is just one of the different examples, because Murat is very familiar with the fact that the state police, in the context of breath test litigation, was also doing the same thing.
Right, yeah, this came in the heels of the Dookhan scandal and the Sonja Farak scandal. This is the third lab scandal that's rocked Massachusetts, and it just goes to show you the seriousness of the case is not determinative of whether or not there's the possibility of flawed forensic science testing. So what was happening in the Hallinan case is that an investigation revealed that the state lab personnel were not calibrating the machines correctly and following basic scientific validation principles, and were essentially putting these breath test machines out in the field without any regard to whether they were accurate, having people take these breath tests, reported to the court as true, and that the machines were functioning properly, and in reality, they weren't calibrated correctly at all. And so people were pleading guilty and getting convicted based on evidence and testimony that turned out to be scientifically inaccurate. And again, this was another cover-up, Ryan, where the government pretended like it didn't happen. This is just astonishing, but what initially happened was the government reported that there was an error in the confirmation process in maybe 13 cases, but the reality was that it was in hundreds of cases. And so what they represented to be a problem that affected less than 1% of all cases ended up affecting somewhere around 30% of these cases. So it was just an enormous lie as to what was going on. And so we litigated that case for the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ultimately tossed out some 27,000 drunk driving convictions. So the issue of misconduct and the government impulse to cover it up is astonishing. It's something that no civilian without really, really strong lawyers could defend against.
And it's not only the cases where you see this government misconduct that can result in this flawed forensic testing taking place, you can also see it in just information that has been later debunked. I mean, a good example of this is the discredited hair microscopy technique, where there was this belief that you could take two different hairs and you can combine them and say that these were a match, similar to a fingerprint. And then it turned out that this was just incredibly suggestive, that it was the examiner and not the evidence that was able to say, oh, this is true, this is a match. And it was just, it was not scientifically reliable, but it was held out as this heralded method of proving whether someone had committed a crime. It was just a bunch of baloney.
It was all guesswork, and really it was all the subjective speculation of the examiner. They called it scientific fact and proof. In reality, it was guesswork. The annals of legal history are filled with examples of this. I mean, like bite mark analysis. So there used to be a scientific theory that everybody's bite mark was like a fingerprint, and it was uniquely identifiable. Totally false. Testing later on occurred, and some validation occurred of this theory, and it was entirely debunked, and yet people have been sent to prison based on this theory.
And we're seeing this, I mean, in tool mark analysis and looking at a shell casing versus the gun that it was fired from and trying to match them up and the issues that come up with that. There's a variety of different ways that the government tries to hold this information out as being reliable when it can be false, it can be subjective, it can be not tested, and it could just be downright inaccurate.
Right, and so the reality is, I mean, an innocent person is absolutely the person that needs the most a skilled lawyer to make sure that they can help to navigate these debunked or false scientific techniques in court.
What we do in these cases is we find the expert in the area. And that could be the expert in the area that we're talking about, or the expert in the area showing that this is all a bunch of malarkey. And what we go through is we educate ourselves and we find out how we can attack the government's witnesses, and we go through with meticulous detail. Murat and I were recently talking about a murder case that I tried recently. We were able to show that the government's theory, based upon the testing that took place, was just completely inflated. They tried to hold out their findings as something that they simply put were not. And because of that education, and speaking to Greg Danis, an expert in the field of firearms and firearms identification, and going through and going down to his lab and him showing me how it works and test firing and doing comparisons and seeing just all the obvious things that the police in this case missed, was able to demonstrate that there were problems in this case that couldn't be ignored that led to an acquittal.
Right, so again, I mean, that's just another great example of why it's just a terrible idea, and I would classify it as a myth that you don't need a lawyer if you're innocent. You absolutely do.